Welcome. Chapter 1. The Chapelbourne Fête. The summer sun shone kindly over Chapelbourne that Saturday afternoon, though a brisk wind tugged at the bunting strung across the village green. Children darted among the stalls, shrieking with laughter. The brass band puffed away at Greensleeves with more enthusiasm than accuracy, and in every corner, neighbours greeted one another with the cheerful courtesies of a fête long anticipated. For weeks, talk of the event had stirred the village, and now at last it was in full swing, the proudest day in Chapelbourne's small but self-sufficient calendar. Mrs. Pottle, the vicar's good-natured wife, bustled from tent to tent, flushed and flurried, directing helpers and exclaiming over the fortunes of the raffle. Only sixpence a ticket, Mrs. Ludlow. And all for the parish roof. Do take another strip, she urged, her bonnet askew in the gusts. Farmer Ludlow, solid and stoical, handed over his coins without comment, though his broad face bore the look of one who suspected he was being parted from them under false pretences. Near the lemonade stall, Miss Jane Marple sat contentedly, a figure of calm in the midst of all the bustle. She had been invited to Chapelbourne by her old friend Mrs. Pottle, who declared she must come for a little change of air, dear Jane, and to see how another parish manages. Miss Marple had accepted with quiet pleasure. She was fond of observing villages not her own, and Chapelbourne, with its square-towered chapel and meandering brook, provided ample scope for observation. She sat knitting, as ever, but her pale blue eyes missed nothing: the quarrel between the Colonel and Lady Eleanor over a misplaced cheque-book, the anxious glance of young Martin Wells as he slipped into the crowd, the officious bustling of Mrs. Arkwright, who could not resist rearranging the lemonade jugs, though the stall was not hers to manage. All these small human habits, so ordinary, so unremarkable to most eyes, were to Miss Marple the very stuff of life. The Colonel Sir Geoffrey Carew cut a formidable figure as he strode about the fête. Tall, broad, with a soldier's bearing, he greeted no one with warmth. His moustache bristled as he barked at the band for being out of tune and at a small boy for dropping a toffee wrapper near the bowling green. Lady Eleanor, pale and elegant, trailed behind him with a strained smile, her lace gloves trembling slightly on her wrists. She accepted greetings with quiet dignity, but those who knew her best whispered that she lived under a shadow at Chapelbourne Hall. "Have some lemonade, Lady Eleanor," called Mrs. Arkwright, bustling forward with a glass in hand. "So refreshing, and I made it myself. One can't be too careful in this heat." She planted the glass firmly before her, ignoring the faint protest from the girl actually in charge of the stall. Lady Eleanor reached for it hesitantly, then paused as Sir Geoffrey strode up, flushed with indignation over some small matter. "Mine, I think," he said brusquely, and without waiting for her reply, seized the glass and drained it in a gulp. Miss Marple's needles clicked. She glanced up, noting Lady Eleanor's startled expression, Mrs. Arkwright's pursed lips, and the faintest flicker in Mrs. Dacre's sharp eyes as she observed from the cake stall. Such details were registered in her quiet mind without comment. The fête continued. Children queued for gingerbread, the raffle prizes were displayed with ceremony, and the brass band struck up once more. Then, quite suddenly, a hush fell. Sir Geoffrey, standing by the tombola, gave a strange, strangled cry, his hand clutched at his throat. His face turned a ghastly shade of grey. For an instant he staggered, eyes bulging, then collapsed heavily to the grass. There was a rush of people, cries of alarm, the flutter of women's skirts. Lady Eleanor fell to her knees beside him, her voice trembling with horror. "Geoffrey, Geoffrey, speak to me." Henry Carroway, her cousin, shouldered his way through the crowd, white with shock. Farmer Ludlow muttered something about a heart attack. Mrs. Arkwright wrung her hands, declaring she had warned him not to overexert himself. It was Dr. Leslie, the village physician, who pushed forward and took charge. He bent over the fallen man, examining with brisk efficiency. The crowd held its breath. At last he straightened, grave and troubled. "He's dead," he said simply, quite suddenly. "I fear it may be his heart." A collective gasp rose. Lady Eleanor gave a low moan, and Henry helped her to her feet. Mrs. Dacres pressed her lips together, eyes sharp and glittering, as if she saw more than she said. Mrs. Pottle dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, murmuring so dreadful at the fate of all places. But Miss Marple sat very still, her knitting folded in her lap. She had seen the faint trace of foam at the Colonel's lips, the unnatural twitch of his hand, the look of confusion in his eyes before he fell. Heart failure, perhaps. But it might also be something else, something far less natural. Digitalis, she thought, recalling her knowledge of herbs. A drug easy to obtain, easy to administer, especially in a glass of lemonade. Dr. Leslie gave instructions for the body to be removed with as much dignity as possible. The fete broke up in a flurry of whispers, villagers exchanging fearful glances as they hurried home. By evening, Chapelbourne, so festive that morning, lay hushed under a cloud of shock. At the vicarage, Reverend Pottle shook his head over the tragedy. "A most unfortunate business," he said solemnly. "Sir Geoffrey was not beloved, but death at a fete, why, it casts a pall over the whole parish." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed quietly. "And yet death seldom comes quite so suddenly without cause." She glanced into the fire, her eyes thoughtful. "I fancy we shall find that there was more to it than appears." Mrs. Pottle gasped. "You mean it might not have been his heart?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "I mean only that human nature is very much the same everywhere. And when one dies in public, with so many watching, one must look closely at the small things. The small things are always the most revealing." Outside, the brook murmured softly under the chapel tower. Chapelbourne slept uneasily that night, doors locked and curtains drawn. In the minds of its people stirred fear, suspicion, and the first whispers of scandal. And in the quiet parlour of the vicarage, Miss Marple, serene and thoughtful, had already begun to unravel the first threads of a pattern that would prove darker and more intricate than anyone yet imagined. Chapter 2. Whispers after the fete. The day after the fete dawned with a sky of washed grey and a faint drizzle that made the hedgerows drip and the cobblestones gleam darkly. The bunting that had fluttered so gaily above the green now hung limp and sodden, while half-collapsed stalls stood forlorn in the damp air. The fete itself, which should have been remembered for raffles, seed cake, and the cheerful clatter of children's races, was instead spoken of in hushed tones, for it was there that Sir Geoffrey Carew had collapsed, a glass of lemonade in his hand, never to rise again. Chapelbourne had never known such scandal. Doors opened early, neighbours peered across fences, and by mid-morning the village was abuzz with speculation. Everyone had a theory, and no two seemed to agree. It was the heat, insisted old Mrs. Finch at the post office, though her eyes gleamed with the thrill of being consulted. "Heat doesn't put that look on a man's face," countered Farmer Ludlow, pounding his stick for emphasis. "I tell you, poison it was, and if so, there's more than one here who'd reason enough." By the time church bells tolled for morning prayers, the story had grown in the telling. Some said Sir Geoffrey had argued with Lady Eleanor only the day before, others that a London creditor had followed him to Chapelbourne demanding payment, and still others that Henry Carew, recently returned, had been heard muttering in the Red Hart Inn about vengeance and justice. Miss Marple, quiet as ever, passed through the chatter with her knitting bag neatly over her arm. She neither encouraged nor contradicted the rumours, but her pale blue eyes missed little. She had learned long ago that people, when they think themselves unobserved, will reveal far more than they intend, and that gossip, though embroidered, often carried a kernel of truth. Reverend Pottle, mild and solemn, did his best to steady his congregation. His sermon spoke of patience in adversity, of the dangers of rash judgment, and of trusting in Providence. Yet the congregation fidgeted, whispering behind him books, eyes darting not toward heaven, but toward Lady Eleanor's pew, where she sat pale and tremulous, her veil drawn low. Mrs. Pottle, bustling with her embroidery frame after the service, confided in Miss Marple. "It is dreadful, Jane, dreadful," she said, her voice low but urgent. "The poor lady looks half in the grave herself, and people are whispering the most cruel things, that she wished her husband dead for his debts, that she had means of her own to gain by it. Such wickedness." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Yes, my dear. But wickedness often lies less in action than in thought. A woman may resent bitterly and yet never act upon it. That is the distinction the village forgets." Mrs. Pottle sighed. "And meanwhile, that dreadful Inspector Graves struts about as though he alone will solve the matter. He'll bluster and bully until someone says what he wants to hear, and then call it justice." Miss Marple gave her serene smile. "Ah, yes. But sometimes bluster makes others careless, and carelessness, as you know, is most revealing." Inspector Graves had indeed been busy. That afternoon he convened a small gathering at the constabulary, summoning Farmer Ludlow, Mrs. Dacres, and Henry Carew in turn. His manner was brusque, his moustache bristling as he thumped his notebook for emphasis. "You quarrelled with him, Ludlow. Land disputes, boundary hedges. Don't deny it. Half the village heard you." Ludlow folded his great arms. I quarrelled. I'd quarrel again if a man tried to steal what's mine, but I'd not slip poison into a glass. I'd meet him face to face, and he knew it." "Fine words, but we'll see," the inspector muttered darkly. Then it was Mrs. Dacres's turn, a sharp-featured woman with a tongue to match. "Sir Geoffrey courted me once, Inspector," she declared dramatically, "and then cast me aside for Eleanor Carew. Do you wonder if I hated him? But hate is not the same as murder. I was at the jam stall the whole afternoon. Half the village saw me there, and half the village saw you slip away." Graves snapped. "We shall see what the maid says." Finally, Henry Carew entered, thin and anxious, his coat still bearing travel stains. "You had debts, Carew. You asked Geoffrey for help, and he refused. You had every cause to strike at him." Henry's face flushed. "He humiliated me. Yes. He called me a wastrel, a leech, but poison. No, if I had wished him gone, I would have told him so to his face." Inspector Graves harumphed, unsatisfied. "You all speak fine words, but words don't prove innocence. Mark me, one of you knows more than you'll say, and I'll find it out." Miss Marple, who had come ostensibly to deliver a basket of scones for the constables, sat quietly in the corner. She said nothing, but her needles moved, and her eyes noted the flush on Henry's cheek, the twitchy Mrs. Dacres's fingers, the way Farmer Ludlow met the inspector's gaze without flinching. That evening, Miss Marple took tea at Mrs. Arkwright's shop, as she so often did. The plump woman bustled cheerfully, setting down seed cake with her usual energy. "Terrible business, Miss Marple, terrible. But we must all do our part to keep spirits up. Why, I've arranged a small charity raffle for next week, in Sir Geoffrey's memory. One must always be seen to help, mustn't one?" Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes mild. "Indeed. And you were so helpful at the fête, were you not? I heard how you bustled about the refreshment table." Mrs. Arkwright flushed, though she laughed it off. "Oh, I cannot bear idleness. If I see something in disorder, I must set it right. I suppose I do thrust myself forward, but better that than to sit and do nothing." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly, "better, perhaps. Though sometimes a little too much zeal in helping can draw attention, don't you think?" The teapot rattled faintly as Mrs. Arkwright set it down. The next day, Miss Marple paid a call at Chapelbourne Hall. Lady Eleanor received her in the faded drawing-room, its velvet cushions worn thin, its curtains heavy with dust. "My husband's death has left me desolate," Lady Eleanor whispered, her hands twisting a handkerchief. "But worse, they accuse me. They say I sought his end for his debts. It is cruel, Miss Marple, cruel." Miss Marple's voice was gentle, cruel indeed. Yet people often strike at the weakest link. Tell me, my dear, did Sir Geoffrey keep papers of any sort? Letters, perhaps, that might have given him power over others. Lady Eleanor's eyes flickered. Yes, he kept a drawer of such things. He believed in keeping hold of weaknesses. He said it was wise to know a man's folly, for one never knew when it might be useful. But after his death, the drawer was empty. The letters were gone. Miss Marple's needles paused, then resumed. Most interesting, she murmured. Very interesting indeed. That night, as the brook murmured outside and the chapel bell tolled the hour, Miss Marple sat by the vicarage fire, her knitting folded neatly beside her. She thought of Sir Geoffrey's debts, of Lady Eleanor's fear, of Henry's bitterness, of Farmer Ludlow's blunt honesty. She thought, too, of Mrs. Arkwright's restless energy, her need to be useful, to arrange, to control. Yes, there were many motives, many resentments, but poison was a weapon of patience, of control, of one who sought not open quarrel but quiet mastery. Her lips curved faintly. Human nature, she reflected, was dreadfully consistent. And somewhere, in the small gestures of these villagers, in the trembling hand, the too bright laugh, the misplaced letter, the truth waited to be seen. Miss Marple would see it. She always did. Chapter 3. Shadows over Chapelbourne. The rain that had begun as a drizzle the day after the fête gave way, by midweek, to heavy showers that turned the lanes to mud and left the hedgerows dripping. Chapelbourne, always a place of quiet order, seemed unsettled. People hurried through the streets rather than lingered. Doors closed more quickly, and curtains twitched as villagers watched one another with a nervousness they could not conceal. Miss Marple, moving at her usual unhurried pace, noted these changes with calm detachment. It was always thus after a crime. The village itself became a stage, each person acting a role, the innocent to anxious to appear innocent, the guilty to eager to blend into the crowd. At the post office, Miss Finch presided, as though she had been given the starring role. She leaned across the counter, her voice lowered for effect. It was poison, without a doubt. Inspector Graves admitted it to me. Not in so many words, of course, but I could tell. And Lady Eleanor, poor soul, will never recover from the shame. Why, only yesterday, a solicitor's letter came for her. From London. One can imagine what that means. Mrs. Ludlow, waiting to post a letter, sniffed. Letters don't kill a man. I say it was that cousin Henry, back from London with debts round his neck, and Sir Geoffrey refuses him money. A man will do desperate things when pressed. Henry, Miss Finch scoffed. To hot-tempered, perhaps, but not sly enough. Poison is a woman's weapon. Mrs. Ludlow, everyone knows that. And what of Mrs. Arkwright, bustling about the fête, if she ran the whole village, always arranging, always in the thick of things? If you ask me, she's too eager to help. Miss Marple accepted her parcel with a mild smile. Yes, eagerness can sometimes hide more than it shows. Human nature is rather like that. People reveal themselves most clearly when they strive too hard to conceal. The two women looked at her blankly, more intent on their own suspicions than her quiet observation. That, Miss Marple thought as she left, was precisely why she so often saw what others missed. Inspector Graves, meanwhile, was determined to make progress. Each morning his stout figure could be seen striding along the high street, notebook in hand, moustache bristling with importance. Poison doesn't pour itself into a glass, he told Reverend Pottle one damp morning. Someone placed it there, and I'll have the villain yet, you may depend upon it. The Reverend, earnest and weary, murmured something about leaving matters to Providence, but the inspector brushed him aside. Providence won't solve my case, sir, evidence will. And mark me, it's here, in this very village. They can whisper and deny all they like, but one of them knows, and I'll root them out. Miss Marple, who happened to be trimming roses in the vicarage garden as the inspector passed, looked up serenely. Perhaps, Inspector, you might consider not only who could have done it, but who was meant to be harmed. Appearances, as you know, are often deceptive. The inspector frowned. Meant to be harmed. The Colonel's dead, ma'am, that's plain enough. Plain enough, Miss Marple agreed mildly. And yet he himself said not mine. A curious phrase, don't you think? It suggests that the glass he drank from was not intended for him. Graves waved her off impatiently. A dying man says any number of foolish things. No, Miss Marple, I'll trust to solid facts. And I have my eye on young Martin Wells yet. He's a hothead. That one. Miss Marple returned to her roses, her expression unreadable. She knew too well that dying words, however garbled, often contain the very truth others overlooked. That evening, the Red Hart Inn was more crowded than usual. Rain had driven villagers indoors, and ale loosened tongues. Henry Carew, gaunt and restless, sat hunched at a corner table, his glass of brandy untouched. Miss Marple, entering quietly with Mrs. Pottle to collect a parcel of flour from the landlord, caught the sound of his voice raised in sudden anger. Yes, I hated him, Henry burst out, slamming his hand on the table. He mocked me, refused me, cast me off like dirt, but kill him? No, if I'd wanted him dead, I'd have faced him man to man, not slipped poison like some craven coward. The room fell silent. Villagers turned to look, their eyes narrowing. Henry flushed, realizing too late what he had said. Miss Marple, pausing near the door, studied him thoughtfully. His bitterness was real, his desperation plain. But his anger was hot and open, not cold and secretive. Poison, she reflected, was not the weapon of such a man. As she and Mrs. Pottle stepped back into the wet night, Mrs. Pottle whispered, "Oh, Jane, did you hear? To confess such hatred, surely that proves he is guilty." Miss Marple shook her head gently. On the contrary, my dear, the guilty seldom proclaim themselves so loudly. It is the innocent, driven by frustration, who shout their truth into the world. The guilty are usually much quieter. The next afternoon, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Dacre's, who had recovered enough to resume her favourite pastime of receiving callers. The sharp-faced woman sat near the fire, a shawl about her shoulders, while her maid hovered silently in the corner. "You know, Miss Marple," Mrs. Dacre said, eyes glittering, "I warned him. I told Geoffrey once that he would make enemies if he continued to trample on people. And see, I was right. But of course no one listens to me until it is too late." Miss Marple's expression was mild. "And you yourself, my dear? You had cause to resent him, did you not?" Mrs. Dacre's lips curved into a thin smile. "Resentment, yes. Murder, no, though I know herbs well enough. My grandmother taught me remedies and poisons. I could have done it, had I wished. But I did not." Her maid stirred uneasily. Miss Marple's eyes flicked toward the girl, whose gaze was fixed on the floor. She said nothing, but filed the reaction away in her mind. Servants, she knew, often noticed far more than their mistresses realized. That evening, Miss Marple walked alone along the lane that bordered the brook. The rain had cleared, and the water glimmered silver in the twilight. An owl hooted from the trees, and the air was sharp with damp earth. She thought of Sir Geoffrey's debts, of Henry's despair, of Mrs. Dacre's hints, of Lady Eleanor's trembling fear. She thought, too, of Mrs. Arkwright, always bustling, always arranging, always so eager to be indispensable. Poison was not a weapon of passion, but of patience. It required calm hands, careful preparation, and above all, the desire to control. Miss Marple paused on the bridge, gazing down at the rippling water. Control. That was the heart of it. Some people could not bear to be powerless, to be overlooked. They must be at the centre of every matter, guiding, arranging, directing. And when that control was threatened, they might act in dreadful ways to preserve it. Her pale eyes grew thoughtful. Yes, She could see the pattern forming. Though others still chased the knots, the truth, she felt, lay very close. By the week's end, Chapelbourne was a village divided. Half believed Lady Eleanor guilty, pointing to her fragile nerves and her gain from her husband's death. Others muttered about Henry, about debts and desperation. A few even whispered of Mrs. Dacre's, with her herbs and her sharp tongue. Through it all, Miss Marple remained serene. She listened, she observed, she knitted. And quietly, she set aside each false lead, each loud protestation, each convenient suspicion, for she knew, as she always did, that the truth lay not in what people shouted, but in what they tried most carefully to hide. And in Chapelbourne, one person's eagerness to appear helpful had already betrayed more than they realized. The brook murmured, the chapel bell tolled, and Miss Marple, gazing into the quiet night, knew that the shadows of Chapelbourne were growing darker. But she also knew that soon, very soon, the light would fall where it must. Chapter 4. The weight of suspicion. The Sunday after the fête dawned grey and heavy, as though the village itself groaned under the burden of suspicion. Chapelbourne, so neat and orderly in its hedgerows and tiled roofs, seemed unsettled. People glanced furtively at one another as they left church, voices lowered in whispers that carried none the less. The murder of Sir Geoffrey Carew had cracked the veneer of village peace, and the second poisoning of Mrs. Dacre's had driven that crack into a widening gulf. Miss Marple, leaving the service quietly with Mrs. Pottle, heard fragments of talk drift past her. Not safe. That's what I say. Eleanor looked pale enough to swoon. Arkwright, always fussing. It was, Miss Marple reflected, entirely as she had expected. Human nature did not change. Fear bred gossip, and gossip bred suspicion. And suspicion, once loosed, did not rest until it found a target, whether true or false. She herself was in no hurry. Truth, like cream, rose to the surface in its own time. One had only to watch patiently ... at the lich gate. Inspector Graves loomed with his notebook, moustache bristling as he cornered Farmer Ludlow. You argued with the Colonel, the inspector barked. You admit it. A quarrel about land, eh? And you expect me to believe you bore him no ill will? Ludlow, red-faced and broad-shouldered, clenched his fists. I told you before, and I'll say it again, I'd sooner hit a man fair and square than slip poison into his cup. That's a woman's way, not mine. Careful what you say, Graves warned, jotting in his notebook. Miss Marple, passing with her quiet tread, looked up mildly. Mr. Ludlow has always struck me as very direct. Poison, I think, is not a direct man's weapon. It requires patience, secrecy, and a taste for control, a most particular sort of mind. The inspector scowled. Patterns and lines, ma'am. I'll take evidence, if you please. He shut his book with a snap. Miss Marple only smiled. She had long ago learnt that inspectors seldom cared for her observations until the end. The Carews of Chapelbourne Hall had not come to church that morning. Lady Eleanor, the villagers whispered, was too fragile to be seen. In truth, she had not left the Hall since the fête. Her cousin Henry came and went in restless strides, but she remained cloistered in the faded drawing-room, curtains half drawn, the weight of suspicion pressing upon her. It was there that Miss Marple called in the afternoon. Lady Eleanor sat by the fire, her delicate hands twisting a handkerchief to tatters. They say dreadful things, Miss Marple, she whispered. That I profited from Geoffrey's death, that I wanted his debts cleared, that I longed for freedom, but I did not. I swear I did not. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. I believe you, my dear. And yet, you must see how others view it. Human beings are quick to judge and slower to forgive. What matters is not their words, but what we can prove true. Lady Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. The letters, Miss Marple. They were in Geoffrey's desk. Letters he used to threaten me, to threaten others too. But they are gone. If only they could be found, perhaps they would show the truth. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her face remained serene. Letters, yes. Letters of weakness, indiscretion, foolish affection. Those were weapons indeed. And someone had taken them. When she left the hall, the air had grown colder. She drew her shawl more tightly about her shoulders and walked slowly toward the village, her mind turning over all she had heard. The post office door banged open as she passed, and Miss Finch hurried out, her eyes alight. "Miss Marple, such goings on. Have you heard?" Mrs. Dacres told her maid she saw Mrs. Arkwright with the lemonade jug at the fête, standing right by it when Sir Geoffrey drank. "Imagine, I said from the first, she was too eager to help." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes, Mrs. Arkwright does have a way of being indispensable. She runs this village, if you ask me," Miss Finch sniffed. "And I wouldn't be surprised if she meant to run it still, with Lady Eleanor out of the way." The gossip flew like swallows at dusk, fast and darting. Miss Marple let it wash over her. She had no intention of dismissing Mrs. Arkwright, but neither would she convict her on whispers alone. That evening, the vicarage was full of talk. Reverend Pottle returned from his parish rounds with grave news. "My dear," he said, settling heavily into his chair, "it has reached my ears that Sir Geoffrey was engaged in blackmail. Parishioners have told me he kept letters, compromising letters. He used them to bend people to his will." Mrs. Pottle gasped, clutching her embroidery. Blackmail, in Chapelbourne. Who could he have held in thrall like that? Miss Marple stirred her tea. "Anyone, my dear. Vanity and weakness are universal. It is not the letters themselves, but the shame they carry, that gives them power. And shame is a thing every village breeds." There was a long silence, broken only by the ticking of the clock and the hiss of the fire. Then Mrs. Pottle said tremulously, "But if he held such letters, and now they are gone, what then?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Then whoever took them had reason to silence him. And that reason, I suspect, is stronger than land quarrels or unpaid debts. It is fear, and fear, once stirred, can be deadly." The following day, the Red Hart Inn was crowded again. Rain drove villagers to its smoky warmth, and talk circled endlessly round the murder. Henry Carroway was there, restless, his eyes haunted. Farmer Ludlow glowered into his mug. Mrs. Arkwright bustled in, cheeks flushed, insisting loudly that the village must not lose heart. Miss Marple, slipping in quietly to fetch a parcel for Mrs. Pottle, observed them all. The bitterness in Henry's voice, the resentment in Ludlow's eyes, the tremor in Mrs. Arkwright's busy hands. And she thought again of Sir Geoffrey's words, "Not mine." Yes, she was certain now. The poisoned glass had not been meant for him. It had been meant for Lady Eleanor. But why, and who stood to gain by her death? That night, in the quiet of her bedroom, Miss Marple set aside her knitting and looked out of the window at the chapel tower. The brook glimmered faintly in the moonlight, carrying with it the secrets of the village. Human nature, she reflected, was dreadfully predictable. The quarrels, the envies, the need to control, these were the same in Chapelbourne as they were in St. Mary Mead or any other village in England. And somewhere among them lay the murderer, clever enough to poison once, bold enough to try again. But cleverness, Miss Marple knew, always betrayed itself in the end. One small detail, one careless gesture, one anxious glance, that was all it took. She turned back from the window, folded her shawl, and laid her knitting aside. Tomorrow, she thought, she would begin to set her quiet trap. And when the guilty hand betrayed itself, as it surely would, she would be ready. Chapter 5. Shadows of the Past. The days that followed brought a restless unease to Chapelbourne. The weather seemed to mirror the mood, skies heavy with cloud, sudden showers turning the lanes into dark ribbons of mud, the brook swollen and murmuring more loudly than usual. Even the bird song in the hedgerows seemed subdued. It was as though the very air had become weighted with secrets. In the tea shop, Mrs. Arkwright sat upright and brisk, her cheeks flushed. Insisting that everything must carry on as usual, she arranged the buns with decisive clinks of tongs, poured tea with a flourish, and spoke in tones calculated to reassure. But Miss Marple, seated at her usual corner table, noticed the small betrayals, the tremor in Mrs. Arkwright's hand, the flicker of her eyes toward every group of whispering women. "Suspicion spreads like butter on hot bread," she said softly to herself, and Mrs. Arkwright, though determined to spread calm, seemed very conscious of the knife in her hand. It was in this same shop that gossip reached a new pitch. Miss Finch, tidy and sharp, leaned forward across the table to declare in her penetrating whisper, "I tell you plainly, Miss Marple, Lady Eleanor had every cause. Sir Geoffrey was blackmailing her. Yes, blackmail. He threatened to sell her family pearls. He threatened to shame her with letters. Letters she once wrote when she was very young. Why, she'd be ruined if they ever came to light." Mrs. Arkwright sniffed loudly. "Pearls and letters. That's village exaggeration, Miss Finch, and you know it. Eleanor is delicate, poor soul. She hasn't the strength for murder." "Delicacy hides strong motives," Miss Finch insisted. "Why else would the Colonel's desk be empty now?" Miss Marple let their words hang in the air, her knitting needles moving quietly. It was not the words themselves that mattered, she knew, but the tones, the glances, the eagerness with which people sought to direct suspicion elsewhere. Mrs. Arkwright's tone had been particularly sharp, too sharp for comfort. Later that day, Miss Marple paid a call at Chapelbourne Hall. The great house seemed more faded than ever, its curtains drawn against the damp grey light, its fires burning low. Lady Eleanor greeted her with trembling composure, though her face bore the signs of many sleepless nights. "They whisper still, Miss Marple," she said in a low voice. "I hear them in the lanes, in the churchyard. They say I am guilty, that I profited from Geoffrey's death, but I tell you, I did not. I am ruined by it, utterly ruined. Henry presses me for money. The creditors write daily, and the letters." "The letters are gone," Miss Marple prompted gently. Lady Eleanor clasped her hands together. "Yes, Geoffrey kept them in his desk, and now the drawer is empty. I never saw them again after that dreadful night." Miss Marple studied her, noting the hollow eyes, the frail hands twisting a handkerchief to shreds. This was no woman capable of calculated poisoning. Desperation she might show, despair certainly, but not the patience for such a deed. As she rose to leave, Miss Marple glanced toward the mantelpiece, where a silver-framed photograph stood, Sir Geoffrey in his uniform, stern and proud. She saw the bitterness in Lady Eleanor's eyes as she looked at it. "He ruined everything," the poor lady whispered. And yet, bitterness was not the same as murder. In the evening, Miss Marple took tea at the vicarage. Reverend Pottle came in damp and weary from his rounds, removing his boots by the fire. "It grows worse, Jane," he said heavily. "The talk is spreading into Marleycombe and even beyond. People are saying Chapelbourne is cursed, and today, one of my parishioners told me Geoffrey Carew once demanded money to keep a scandal quiet. He had, it seems, threatened not only his wife, but others besides. Blackmail," Miss Marple murmured. "Yes, blackmail," said the vicar gravely. "It is an ugly word, but it fits." Mrs. Pottle gasped, her embroidery tumbling into her lap. "But who could he have held in his power?" "Almost anyone," Miss Marple said softly. "Weakness is not uncommon, my dear. And Geoffrey Carew had a talent for sniffing it out. It is quite possible that someone feared exposure more than they feared sin itself. That fear could have been enough to prompt poison." Mrs. Pottle shivered. "But then, the murderer could be anyone at all." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes regarded the fire. "Not anyone, my dear. Only someone who had the opportunity and the temperament." The following day, the village gathered at the Red Hart Inn once more. Rain pelted against the windows, the hearth blazed, and the air was thick with pipe smoke and murmured speculation. Farmer Ludlow sat apart, scowling into his mug. Henry Caraway leaned against the wall, his face haggard, his movements restless. Mrs. Dacres, dramatically wrapped in shawls, despite the heat, spoke loudly of her own narrow escape, insisting that she had seen things others ignored, and at the centre, as always, bustled Mrs. Arkwright, cheeks flushed, insisting upon order. "We must keep our heads," she declared, clapping her hands together as though commanding a church bazaar. "The inspector will find the villain soon enough, you'll see. But meanwhile, we must not give way to idle chatter." Her words had scarcely left her lips before she leaned forward conspiratorially to Jasper Hawch, though between ourselves, I did notice Lady Eleanor looking most peculiar that evening at the fête. Pale as paper, she was, and she hardly touched her glass. "Suspicious, don't you think?" Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner with her knitting bag, raised her eyes just in time to see the flicker of Mrs. Arkwright's gaze, quick, anxious, darting. Yes, always arranging, always directing suspicion, always managing. The pieces were falling more neatly into place. But human nature, Miss Marple knew, was not so simple. One must never seize upon the obvious without testing it. For just as weeds often tangled together in a garden, so too did motives in a village. Resentment, desperation, fear, pride, all intertwined, until the true root lay hidden beneath. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her bedroom window, watching the brook glimmer in the moonlight. She let her mind drift back to the fête, the laughter, the bunting, the lemonade glasses lined neatly on the table. She saw again Sir Geoffrey's impatient hands seizing a glass, his sudden grimace, his cry, "Not mine." Yes, that was the key. That single phrase contained the truth. Sir Geoffrey had not drunk from his own glass, but another's. The poison had been meant not for him, but for the one standing nearest, Lady Eleanor. Miss Marple's knitting lay forgotten in her lap, as she whispered softly to herself, "The wrong person died." And everything since has been smoke to hide that fact. She drew her shawl about her shoulders and gazed steadily into the night. The murderer had struck once, and again, and soon, perhaps, would strike a third time. Human nature was constant, vanity, fear, and the lust for control would not rest until checked. And Miss Marple, quiet and watchful, knew she must be ready. For the shadow over Chapelbourne was growing darker, and the hour of revelation was drawing near. Chapter 6. A Second Shock. By the fourth morning after the fête, Chapelbourne awoke to more than rumour. It awoke to alarm. At 8:30, young Daisy Popple came running breathlessly into the vicarage kitchen, her cheeks flushed, her hair flying loose from its ribbon. "Auntie, Auntie," she cried, "Mrs. Dacres, she's been taken poorly by the brook. They say she near died." Mrs. Popple dropped her spoon with a clatter. "Good heavens, child, what are you saying?" "She drank something," Daisy gasped, clutching at her pinafore. "Lemonade." And then she screamed, "Dr. Leslie is there now." Miss Marple, seated at the table with her morning tea, set her cup carefully down upon its saucer. Her expression was calm, but her eyes sharpened. "That is most interesting," she said softly. By the brook, half the village had already gathered. People hovered at a cautious distance, murmuring in consternation, while Dr. Leslie knelt over Mrs. Dacres, who lay propped against the trunk of a willow tree. Her sharp face was ghastly pale, her lips tinged an ominous blue. "It was the lemonade," she croaked faintly. "I only took a sip, dreadful taste." "Poison again," muttered Jenkins the verger, crossing himself. Inspector Graves, who had arrived in a state of great agitation, puffed and thundered. "Another poisoning. Well, this settles it. We've a devil among us." Dr. Leslie rose, his face grave. "She will recover," he pronounced. The dose was small, badly mixed, enough to sicken, not to kill. A buzz of speculation broke out at once. Who had given her the glass? Where had it come from? What did it mean? Miss Marple, standing a little apart, observed without intruding. She noticed Mrs. Arkwright bustling officiously forward with smelling salts, pressing them almost into Mrs. Dacre's nose. She noticed Farmer Ludlow scowling darkly, his great arms folded across his chest. She noticed Lady Eleanor standing pale and silent at the edge of the crowd. And she noticed Mrs. Dacre herself clinging to Dr. Leslie's hand with more fear than weakness. The scene, Miss Marple reflected, was almost theatrical, and theatre often concealed design. By noon, the village was in ferment. At the post office, Miss Finch declared in tones of certainty, "It was meant to silence her. I've always said she knew something about the Colonel. Now the villain has shown their hand." "Rubbish," snapped Mrs. Arkwright, who stood behind her in the queue. "She made an enemy. That's all. Tongues that wag to freely invite trouble." "But who would strike twice in the same manner?" asked Reverend Pottle helplessly, joining them. "Surely not Martin, when he is locked away." Inspector Graves, overhearing, bristled like an affronted turkey. "Don't jump to conclusions, sir. He may have had an accomplice, but his bluster was weak. The implication was plain. If Martin Wells remained under lock and key, then the second poisoning suggested his innocence. That evening Miss Marple made a quiet call upon Mrs. Dacre, who had been carried home and put to bed with much fuss. The invalid was pale, but her sharp eyes glittered with their usual malice. "They tried to kill me, Miss Marple," she declared dramatically, clutching her coverlet. "Murder me, just as they did Sir Geoffrey, because I knew too much, that's why. I saw things." Miss Marple's tone was soothing. "And what, my dear, did you see?" Mrs. Dacre leaned forward, lowering her voice. "At the fête, I saw Sir Geoffrey take the wrong glass. I saw it plain as day. And I saw Mrs. Arkwright watching, tight-lipped. She knew it wasn't his." Miss Marple inclined her head. "And you mentioned this?" "I did," Mrs. Dacre said slyly, "to one or two, just enough to remind people that I wasn't blind. And now look what's happened, someone wants me silenced. Or perhaps," Miss Marple said gently, "someone wishes it to appear so." Mrs. Dacre frowned. "What do you mean?" But Miss Marple only patted her hand and said no more. Back at the vicarage that night, the little household gathered in solemn discussion. "It proves Martin's innocence," cried Mrs. Pottle fervently. "How could he, locked away, attempt such a thing?" The vicar shook his head. "The inspector will not see it that way. He's blinded by his evidence." Miss Marple's smile was faint. "Evidence can be misleading. Logic is sometimes the greater evidence. Tell me, have either of you noticed Mrs. Arkwright's manner of late?" Mrs. Pottle blinked. "She has been most attentive, bringing broths, advising the doctor, helping Mrs. Dacre. Surely that proves her kindness." "Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured, "or perhaps it proves a wish to be indispensable." Mrs. Pottle started. "You don't mean—" But Miss Marple only resumed her knitting, her eyes thoughtful. The following day, a new element entered the scene. Henry Carew, Lady Eleanor's cousin, returned suddenly from London. He appeared travel-stained at the inn, demanding to see his cousin at the hall. Gossip ran ahead of him, sparks on dry straw. He had failed in his ventures. Creditors hounded him, and Sir Geoffrey had refused him assistance. "They say he begged Eleanor for money," Miss Finch whispered gleefully. "And now she inherits. Suspicious, wouldn't you say?" Miss Marple merely inclined her head. She had observed Henry's face when he dismounted. Bitter, haggard, impatient. The face of a man unused to waiting, but poison required patience. That was not Henry Carraway's gift. Inspector Graves, meanwhile, was in difficulties. His neat case against Martin Wells had collapsed like a poorly tied bundle. He muttered of accomplices, of conspiracies, but the villagers began to doubt his competence. "I'll get to the bottom of it yet," he declared at the vicarage, pounding the table. "Mark me, Miss Marple, these country cases are tangled, but I've never yet failed." Miss Marple's expression was mild. "Yes, Inspector. But remember, the tangle lies not always in the facts, but in human nature. It is in the little threads of behaviour, not the great knots of evidence, that truth reveals itself. The inspector glared, unconvinced, but the Reverend nodded slowly. That night, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting folded aside. The brook shimmered silver under the moonlight. An owl called from the woods. She thought of all she had learned. 2 poisonings, one fatal, one not, both in public places, both with lemonade. Both oddly careless, one relying on chance, the other too weak to kill. Mrs. Arkwright's officiousness, her constant presence. Mrs. Dacre's sly hints, Lady Eleanor's fragility, Henry Carroway's bitterness, and Martin, too impetuous, too young. It was not Martin. Nor was it Henry. No, this was older hands, patient hands. The wrong glass, Miss Marple murmured. Always. It comes back to that. The poison was not meant for Sir Geoffrey at all. She drew her shawl about her shoulders and looked steadily into the night. The murderer had struck again, and in so doing, had betrayed a little more of their hand. Chapter 7. Whispers and Shadows. The poisoning of Mrs. Dacre's had not killed her, but it had unsettled Chapelbourne more deeply than Sir Geoffrey's death itself. For the Colonel, tyrant though he was, might have fallen to accident, to fate, even to Providence. But a second attempt, and with poison once more, made the word murderer echo in every parlour. By Tuesday, doors were shut earlier, shutters drawn tight, children were called in before dusk, and even the grocer's boy no longer whistled on his errand rounds. Fear is infectious, Miss Marple reflected, and in Chapelbourne it spread faster than measles. She herself went quietly about her way, knitting bag at her side, calling on 1 or 2 neighbours, listening to their words and more carefully, to their silences. For silences often revealed what words did not. At the Red Hart in that afternoon, Miss Marple found Henry Carroway pacing by the hearth, his face lined and impatient. A glass of ale stood untouched before him. It's insufferable, Miss Marple, he burst out as she greeted him. To see Eleanor accused by implication, her name sullied by gossip. She's as innocent as I am. Miss Marple sat, folding her hands. Gossip, my dear Mr. Carroway, is like ivy. It clings to the nearest wall, but often it covers the truth rather than reveals it. He looked at her sharply. Do you mean you suspect another? I mean only that one must be cautious. Appearances can deceive. Henry sank down heavily. If only Geoffrey had lived. He would never have allowed this circus. I tell you frankly, Miss Marple, my cousin is not strong enough to endure it. Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. And yet she does endure, with your help, I dare say. Henry's mouth twisted bitterly. With what help, madam? I've naught to give her. Geoffrey saw to that. The man ruined me, and when I begged a loan, he laughed in my face, laughed. A dangerous light flickered in his eyes, but it was the light of temper, not of cunning. Miss Marple noted it quietly. Poison was not poured in rage. Poison was poured with calm hands and patient waiting. That evening, Reverend and Mrs. Pottle joined Miss Marple in the parlour, where the fire flickered warmly against the encroaching dark. Daisy lingered too, eyes wide with curiosity. Mrs. Pottle wrung her hands. What is to become of us, Jane? The whole village is turned upside down. Daisy won't sleep for fear someone will slip poison into the milk jug. And I tremble each time I pour the tea, Reverend Pottle sighed. I cannot keep order at the vestry. Jenkins mutters that the devil walks among us. Hodge insists on a witch hunt. Graves is determined to cling to Martin's guilt, but the people grow restless. Miss Marple's needles click serenely. It is only human nature, my dear friends. People dislike uncertainty more than danger. When they cannot see the culprit, they imagine him everywhere. Daisy piped up from her corner. But you don't think it's Martin, do you, Miss Marple? Miss Marple smiled faintly. I think Martin is hot-headed, rash, and foolish. But poison? No, that is a different nature altogether. The Reverend leaned forward. "Then whom do you suspect?" "Ah," Miss Marple said softly, "it is too soon for certainty. But one must observe who insists most on helping. For help, when too eager, sometimes hides another purpose." Mrs. Pottle gasped. "You mean Mrs. Arkwright?" Miss Marple gave no direct answer. Her eyes, however, were very thoughtful. The next morning brought another ripple of scandal. Miss Finch, sorting the post, had discovered an envelope pushed under her door, another anonymous letter. She showed it, trembling, to the inspector and half the village besides. "Mark my words," the note declared in cramped script, Lady Eleanor had cause to wish her husband dead, and Mrs. Dacres knows it. "Look to the hall, and you will see the truth." Mrs. Pottle, who read it aloud at the grocer's, nearly fainted with shock. "Oh, Jane, it's wicked, wicked. Why must these letters keep coming?" Miss Marple, when she saw it, merely shook her head. "Anonymous letters, my dear, are the coward's weapon. But they often betray more about the writer than the accused." Inspector Graves, however, was triumphant. "There you are, more proof." Eleanor again at the centre. "I shall question her most severely this time." But when he strode to the hall that afternoon, Miss Marple followed discreetly. She found Lady Eleanor in tears, Henry pacing angrily, and Inspector Graves blustering with little effect. "I did not kill Geoffrey," Lady Eleanor cried. "Yes, he was cruel, yes, he threatened me with those letters he kept. But I swear I never touched his medicines. I am too afraid of such things." Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on her arm. "Courage, my dear. The truth will out. It always does." Her voice was calm, but inwardly her thoughts turned on that one phrase, those letters, the blackmail papers Sir Geoffrey had kept, and which had vanished after his death. Their absence was no accident. That evening, as twilight deepened into night, Miss Marple sat once more by her window, shawl drawn about her shoulders. The brook gleamed silver in the moonlight, the chapel tower rose dark against the stars. The village lay hushed, but within that hush she felt the stir of unease. She thought again of Daisy's account of Sir Geoffrey's last words. "Not mine." She thought of Mrs. Dacres's sly claim to have seen him take the wrong glass. And she thought of Mrs. Arkwright's anxious hovering, her hands forever arranging, correcting, pouring. The murderer, Miss Marple knew, had struck twice. Once by accident, for Sir Geoffrey had drunk what was not intended for him, and once in calculation, when Mrs. Dacres was made ill to strengthen suspicion elsewhere. But there would be a third attempt. She was certain of it. Poisoners were seldom content with failure. Their vanity urged them on. And vanity, Miss Marple reflected, was always the undoing of such a person. She closed her eyes briefly, then rose and placed her knitting carefully aside. It was time, she thought, to set the snare, but it must be delicate, and it must be soon. For the longer Chapelbourne lived in shadow, the more dangerous the shadows would become. The next day, she began quietly to prepare. A word to Reverend Pottle here, a suggestion to Mrs. Pottle there. Nothing alarming, nothing dramatic, only the idea of a small, comforting tea, a neighbourly gathering, to restore peace of mind. And of course, there would be lemonade. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly, though her face remained solemn. For human nature, she knew, could not resist repeating itself, and when it did, she would be watching. Chapter 8. The gathering storm. The days that followed were restless ones in Chapelbourne. Whispers lingered at every shop counter, voices hushed whenever a neighbour entered the room. The vicarage was besieged with villagers bringing tidbits of gossip disguised as news, each desperate to prove they had guessed the truth first. And still the shadow of fear hung heavy, the knowledge that a poisoner walked freely among them. Miss Marple moved serenely through it all, a quiet presence, knitting needles flashing in her lap. But behind the soft click of her needles, her mind spun steadily, weaving the fragments of fear and suspicion into a clearer pattern. She knew now what must be done. A stage must be set, a simple domestic stage where everyone would feel safe, and where the guilty hand would reveal itself by instinct. That was the way with human nature, she reflected. People could restrain their words, but never their habits. So she suggested, gently and without fuss, that the Reverend and Mrs. Pottle host a little tea at the vicarage. "Nothing grand, my dear," she said to Mrs. Pottle, who looked horrified at the thought. "Just a few neighbours, a jug of lemonade, a plate of seed cake. People need reassuring, and sometimes reassurance is the best bait." Mrs. Pottle, though nervous, agreed. "Yes, Jane, perhaps you are right. If we all sit together, it may soothe things." "Though I tremble to think of serving lemonade again," Miss Marple smiled serenely. "Sometimes, my dear, one must hold up a mirror and let the guilty look upon themselves." On Thursday afternoon, the invitations were quietly issued. Mrs. Pottle made them sound as though they came directly from Inspector Graves, who, though blustering and unconvinced, allowed it for the sake of keeping the villagers quiet. In truth, the inspector himself was curious. He had the grudging sense that Miss Marple saw more than she let on, though he would never admit it aloud. By Saturday morning, the whole village buzzed with expectation. Would the murderer be among them at tea? Would something happen? Some declared they would not go, then promptly changed their minds, unwilling to be left out of what might prove decisive. Miss Marple, sitting by her window with her knitting, smiled faintly to herself. It was all unfolding as she had hoped. That afternoon, the vicarage parlour was prepared. Daisy polished the best china until it gleamed. Mrs. Pottle laid a lace cloth over the table and set out plates of scones and seed cake. At the centre, standing in a shaft of late summer sunlight, was a large jug of lemonade, beads of condensation glistening on its glass sides. "Must we, Jane?" Mrs. Pottle whispered anxiously, glancing at it. "Indeed, my dear," Miss Marple replied gently. "If one fears a thing, one must bring it into the light. Fear grows in shadows." By 4:30, the guests began to arrive. Mrs. Arkwright came first, bustling in with flushed cheeks and determined cheerfulness. "So kind of you, dear Mrs. Pottle. I said to myself, I must come and help. What's to be done first?" "The pouring, the slicing. Leave it to me." Behind her came Farmer Ludlow, stiff and uncomfortable, muttering something about not staying long. Henry Carroway arrived next, watchful and tense, Lady Eleanor pale at his side. Mrs. Dacres insisted on attending, leaning dramatically on her maid's arm, her eyes bright with curiosity. And last of all, Inspector Graves appeared, moustache bristling, notebook at the ready, muttering about woman's contrivances. Miss Marple was already seated in a chair by the fire, knitting in her lap. She greeted each guest with mild courtesy, her pale blue eyes noting every detail, the restless flick of Mrs. Arkwright's hands, the suspicious glances between neighbours, Lady Eleanor's nervous fingers tightening on her handkerchief. It was, she thought, the very picture of human nature under strain. The tea began as any other. Mrs. Pottle, flustered, poured cups, plates off, scones were passed round, conversation fluttered nervously, remarks about the weather, about the harvest, about anything but the true reason for their gathering. But all the while, the jug of lemonade gleamed in the centre of the table. At last, Mrs. Pottle rose. Perhaps a glass of lemonade. She faltered. "Oh, allow me," cried Mrs. Arkwright, stepping forward with brisk decisiveness. She seized the jug with a practised hand, smiling as she filled the first glass. "So refreshing, in this heat. Lady Eleanor, my dear, you must have one." She placed the glass carefully before Eleanor, arranging it just so near her hand. Her eyes, sharp and anxious, followed it as though the world depended upon it. Lady Eleanor hesitated, reaching, then drew back nervously to fumble for a napkin. Quick as thought, Mrs. Arkwright snatched up the glass. "Here, my dear, let me fetch you a fresher one. This is not quite full." She slid it aside, replacing it smoothly with another. The parlour seemed to hold its breath. Miss Marple sat down her knitting. Her voice, calm but clear, carried across the silence. "How very kind of you, Mrs. Arkwright, but perhaps, just this once, we might leave the glasses as they are." Every eye in the room turned. Mrs. Arkwright froze, the jug in her hand, her face suddenly pale. Inspector Graves straightened. "What's this, Miss Marple? What are you suggesting?" Miss Marple rose, her expression serene. "I am suggesting, Inspector, that we have just seen the murderer at her work." A gasp went round the room. Lady Eleanor cried out faintly. Henry leapt to his feet, fists clenched. Mrs. Dacres clutched her maid's arm, eyes glittering with triumph. Farmer Ludlow muttered, "By heaven!" Under his breath, Mrs. Arkwright gave a choking laugh. "Murderer, don't be absurd. I was only trying to help, as I always do. Everyone knows I manage such things." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "everyone knows. You managed the fête, did you not? Bustling about, arranging the drinks, slicing the cakes. It was then that you slipped the poison into a glass of lemonade. But Sir Geoffrey, impatient as ever, seized the wrong glass. He even said so, not mine, and so he died." A heavy silence fell. Miss Marple continued, her tone gentle but inexorable. "Later, when Mrs. Dacres began hinting that she had seen something, you acted again, not to kill, for that would have been too obvious, but to make her ill enough to stir suspicion elsewhere. And now, today, you could not resist. You placed a glass before Lady Eleanor's hand, and when she hesitated, you sought to exchange it." Her pale eyes rested on Mrs. Arkwright. "That, Inspector, is guilt revealing itself." The room erupted. Lady Eleanor sobbed. Henry shouted in outrage. Mrs. Dacres declared she had always suspected it. Farmer Ludlow shook his head grimly. Inspector Graves barked for silence. His face was flushed, but there was respect in his eyes as he turned to Mrs. Arkwright. "Well, madam, what have you to say for yourself?" Mrs. Arkwright's hands trembled. "It was for Eleanor's sake," she cried desperately. "Geoffrey ruined her, ruined us all. I only meant to save her, to protect her." "You must see that." Lady Eleanor recoiled in horror. "Protect me, by murdering my husband." Mrs. Arkwright's face twisted. "He would have destroyed you. He would have destroyed Chapelbourne. I did what had to be done." Her words hung in the stunned silence. Then Inspector Graves stepped forward. Grimly, "That will do. Alice Arkwright, you are under arrest for the murder of Colonel Sir Geoffrey Carew." The constables moved forward. Mrs. Arkwright struggled once, then sagged, her face pale and furious. "Falls," she hissed, "he deserved it. You'll thank me one day." But no one answered. Miss Marple sat serenely once more, her needles clicking softly, as the guilty woman was led away. That evening, as the lamps were lit and the guests departed in shaken silence, Reverend Pottle stood with Miss Marple by the fire. "I do not know how you saw it, Jane," he said, awed. Miss Marple smiled gently. "It was not cleverness, my dear. Only human nature." Mrs. Arkwright could not help herself. A busybody cannot resist meddling, even when meddling betrays her. And that, I fear, is always the way. She gazed into the flames, her pale eyes thoughtful. "But Chapelbourne will rest easier now, and that, perhaps, is enough." The brook murmured softly beyond the window, carrying the last shadows of fear away into the night. Chapter 9. The village reacts. The arrest of Mrs. Arkwright shook Chapelbourne to its very core. The bustling, plump woman who had seemed so indispensable, who organized the fete, who scolded the choir, who baked endless trays of jam tarts for church sales, was now the whispered name on every lip. That she could be a poisoner seemed unthinkable, and yet the evidence, spoken aloud by Miss Marple herself, had been damning. The vicarage parlour, where the trap had been sprung, still seemed to hum with echoes of that dreadful Sunday afternoon. Reverend Pottle had barely managed to steady his trembling hands as he prayed for composure. Mrs. Pottle had broken down weeping afterwards, declaring she would never dare host another tea as long as she lived. Inspector Graves had left puffed up with a sense of his own importance, though even he admitted, grudgingly, that Miss Marple had seen the truth more clearly than anyone else, and Miss Marple herself. She sat serenely by the vicarage hearth that evening, knitting in her lap, as calm as though nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Yet beneath her quiet exterior, her thoughts were not entirely at rest. For though the murderer had been revealed, the matter was not as simple as it appeared, grudgingly, that Miss Marple had seen the truth more clearly than anyone else, and Miss Marple herself. She sat serenely by the vicarage hearth that evening, knitting in her lap, as calm as though nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Yet beneath her quiet exterior, her thoughts were not entirely at rest. For though the murderer had been revealed, the matter was not as simple as it appeared. The next morning, Chapelbourne awoke to a new world. News spread faster than fire on a dry heath. From baker to blacksmith, from schoolroom to farmhouse, the tale grew and twisted in the telling. "Arkwright, I never trusted her," declared Jenkins the verger as he swept the chapel steps. "Always pushing herself forward, always arranging." "Nonsense," countered Mrs. Ludlow at the butcher's. "She baked cakes for every bazaar. She'd have given you the shawl off her back." "It can't be true." "But it was," murmured Mrs. Finch at the post office, with the relish of one whose business thrived on scandal. "I heard it from Miss Marple herself." She poured the glass, set it right before Lady Eleanor. "If that's not guilt, I don't know what is." Letters flew in and out of the village, neighbours wrote to distant cousins, and Chapelbourne's name appeared in London newspapers for the first time in years. Some reporters even tried to arrive by train, only to be sent firmly away by Inspector Graves, who declared he would have no yellow journalism interfering with police procedure. Miss Marple, for her part, went about her usual ways, receiving courtesy visits from neighbours who came ostensibly to see how she was keeping but in truth sought to hear every detail from her own lips. She told them little, merely offering tea and smiling politely as they poured out their amazement. What troubled her most was not Mrs. Arkwright's guilt, but Lady Eleanor's fragility. The poor woman had endured her husband's cruelty, then the horror of his death, then the burden of suspicion, and now the dreadful revelation that her closest friend had plotted her own murder. Miss Marple walked up to Chapelbourne Hall one afternoon, her shawl wrapped close against the late summer wind. The hall looked drearier than ever, curtains drawn, silver tarnished, gardens unkempt. Lady Eleanor received her in the drawing-room, pale as a ghost, her handkerchief clenched tightly in one hand. "Jane," she whispered, "I cannot bear it. Alice, dear Alice, how could she? She was my comfort through all those dreadful quarrels with Geoffrey. She managed everything for me." And all the while, her voice broke. Miss Marple sat beside her, patting her hand with quiet firmness. "My dear, she did not love you for yourself. She loved the power of arranging your life, of being indispensable. That kind of love is not kindness, Eleanor, it is control." Lady Eleanor bowed her head, tears falling onto the faded carpet. "And I let her rule me. I never had the strength Geoffrey demanded, nor the independence Alice feared. I feel as though my life has been nothing but submission." "Not so," Miss Marple said gently. "You have survived, and survival is no small thing. Now you are free, not only of Geoffrey, but of Alice too. The whole is yours, your life is yours. You must find strength in that." Lady Eleanor looked at her through tears. "Do you truly think so?" Miss Marple smiled serenely. "I know so. Human nature may wound us dreadfully, but it also carries the seeds of renewal." Meanwhile, Inspector Graves strutted about the village with renewed authority, declaring to anyone who would listen that the matter was as good as closed. The poisoner was behind bars, awaiting trial at the assizes, and Chapelbourne would return to peace. Yet not all shared his certainty. Farmer Ludlow, blunt as ever, muttered to Miss Marple at the market, "Poison's a sly business." Don't sit easy with me. Knowing as she could do it twice and near get away with it seems unnatural somehow. And Mrs. Dacre's, never one to let another woman's disgrace go unremarked, spread her own embroidered version of events. She hated me. You know, she confided loudly at the inn, tried to silence me, because I alone saw through her. But she did not succeed. I always said she meddled too much. Miss Marple listened to all with patient courtesy, but her thoughts remained steady. Yes, Mrs. Arkwright was guilty, and yet there were layers even in guilt. For poison was not merely a crime of opportunity, but a crime of psychology. It revealed character as much as it revealed malice. She reflected, as she walked back through the village lanes, on how often murder grew not from hatred, but from distorted love, the desperate wish to control, to protect, to bind another's life to one's own. Alice Arkwright had not meant to rid the world of Geoffrey alone. She had meant to secure Eleanor's dependence forever. It was monstrous, and yet, in its own twisted way, pitiable. That evening, Miss Marple sat by the vicarage fire with Reverend and Mrs. Pottle. The lamplight glowed warmly on the walls, though the vicarage itself felt uneasy after such events. Mrs. Pottle sighed. I cannot think how we shall ever return to ordinary life. Tea parties and sewing circles will seem so trivial now. My dear, Miss Marple said softly, ordinary life is the very fabric that sustains us. Without it, murder would triumph. We must return to teas and sewing, for they are the stitches that mend the rent in the cloth. Reverend Pottle nodded gravely. Well spoken, Jane, and yet it will be a long while before Chapelbourne forgets. Forget, Miss Marple repeated. Her needles clicked gently in her lap. No, my dear Arthur, villages never forget. They absorb. They turn even tragedy into part of the tapestry. People will whisper of Alice Arkwright for years to come, but in time, she will become not a wound, but a warning. That is the way of human nature. Mrs. Pottle shivered faintly. A warning indeed. To think, she was in this very room, pouring out lemonade. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. Yes, and if you observe closely, people always reveal themselves in the little things, even lemonade. The days that followed brought gradual quiet. The newspapers tired of the tale. New scandals arose elsewhere, and Chapelbourne returned to its rhythms. The grocer weighing sugar, the children playing by the brook, the chapel bell tolling in the evening air. But the undercurrent remained. Doors that once stood open were shut earlier at night. Friends who had trusted one another now paused, considering what secrets might yet be hidden. And no Mrs. Arkwright's name was spoken. Less often. It lingered like a shadow at the edge of every gathering. Miss Marple, however, felt the storm had passed. The guilty hand was revealed, the truth spoken. Now, the work of healing belonged to the village itself. She would continue to observe, to listen, to knit, for human nature, Ella ceased to provide new lessons. But for now, at least, Chapelbourne was safe again. She folded her knitting one evening and looked out the vicarage window at the chapel tower rising against the twilight sky. The brook glimmered silver beneath it, whispering softly through the stillness. Yes, she murmured to herself, human nature is dreadfully predictable, and yet, how endlessly surprising. Chapter 10. Preparations for the trial. Chapelbourne had endured many shocks in recent weeks, but none loomed so large as the knowledge that Mrs. Arkwright, of all people, was to stand trial for murder. The quiet lanes of the village seemed charged with anticipation. It was no longer merely gossip at the post office or mutterings at the Red Hart Inn. Now there was talk of courts, juries, and the assizes in the county town. The newspapers, which had briefly wearied of the tale, returned in force once word of the trial spread. Reporters with slicked hair and sharp pencils descended upon Chapelbourne once more, eager for interviews, sketches, and the human interest details that transform tragedy into headlines. They lingered near the inn, lurked outside the hall gates, and even dared to knock at the vicarage door until Reverend Pottle, scandalized, ordered them away. Inspector Graves, for his part, was suddenly a man much in demand. He walked the lanes with his chest puffed out, moustache bristling, as though he personally had laid hands upon Mrs. Arkwright at the moment of her crime. His notebook was a constant companion, and he relished repeating, loudly, that the law would have its day, thanks to proper police work. Miss Marple, sitting in her favourite chair with her knitting in her lap, said nothing of this boast, though Mrs. Pottle's lips twitched more than once as she listened to the inspector's claims. The villagers, meanwhile, were divided. She was always bossy, always meddling, muttered Farmer Ludlow one morning in the grocer's. Doesn't surprise me one jot that she thought to meddle with poison too. But Mrs. Ludlow shook her head sharply. That's nonsense, John Ludlow. Alice was a pillar of the community. She ran every fête we ever had. If she hadn't organized us, we'd all be living like pigs in muck. You mark my words, they'll find it's all some dreadful mistake. At the post office, Miss Finch relished her new role as village commentator. There's to be a trial, you see, and they say the judge himself is known for his severity. Oh, it will be the end of Mrs. Arkwright entirely. I always said there was something peculiar about her, though of course I never breathed it aloud until now. Miss Marple listened to all of it with her usual gentle courtesy, yet behind her mild blue eyes, she reflected how quickly human nature could turn. Yesterday's friend was today's villain. Yesterday's dependence became today's disdain. It was not cruelty so much as the instinct of self-preservation. No one liked to be reminded that evil might lurk in their midst, so they pushed it away, turning the culprit into something foreign, different, never truly one of them. Lady Eleanor Carew, however, could not so easily adjust. She had spent days in near seclusion, rising late, wandering the faded rooms of Chapelbourne Hall like a ghost. Miss Marple called upon her often, never pressing, simply sitting quietly in her company, while Eleanor attempted to come to terms with the betrayal of one she had trusted most. One afternoon, Eleanor spoke, her voice low but trembling. She wanted me gone, Jane. All those years of friendship, of tea, of advice, of her constant chatter. And it was all a mask. She hated me because she needed me. That is the cruelest part. Miss Marple reached across and laid a gentle hand upon hers. It was not hatred, my dear. It was possession. Some natures must always hold sway over others. When that sway is threatened, they strike out. You must not think of yourself as weak for having been guided. Many strong women, many clever ones, have fallen prey to such dependence. What matters is that you are free of it now. Lady Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, yet she nodded faintly. As the date of the trial drew nearer, Inspector Graves grew restless. He had assembled witnesses, collected statements, and polished his recollections until they gleamed like medals. Yet, for all his bluster, he remained secretly anxious. He was no fool. He knew it was Miss Marple's quiet words, her steady observations, that had pierced the veil of appearances. One evening, he arrived at the vicarage uninvited, plopping heavily into a chair and demanding a cup of tea. I've no objection to credit where it's due, he declared, moustache quivering. But of course the Crown Counsel must present the case in its proper form. Can't have it all muddled with talk of knitting and lemonade. No jury would follow it. Miss Marple looked up serenely from her knitting. On the contrary, Inspector, juries are made up of ordinary men and women. They understand ordinary things. Knitting, lemonade, a woman's fussing hands. These are the very details they will comprehend. Grand speeches may impress, but it is the small truths that convict. The inspector harumphed, uncomfortable. Well, perhaps there's something in that. Still, it doesn't sit easy with me, being shown up by a lady with needles. Miss Marple smiled gently. I should not worry, Inspector. The important thing is not who solves a crime, but that justice is served. And you will have the satisfaction of seeing justice done. The Sunday before the trial, the chapel was unusually full. Villagers came not only to pray, but to look at one another, to exchange whispers in the porch, to measure how each neighbour was bearing the strain. Reverend Pottle preached a sermon on forgiveness, but his voice trembled, and many wondered privately whether Alice Arkwright could ever be forgiven at all. Mrs. Dacres made a dramatic appearance, leaning on her maid and declaring, in stage whispers, that she had nearly been poisoned herself and deserved gratitude from all. Henry Carroway glowered in the back pew, muttering that Eleanor was still being treated unfairly by gossip. And throughout it all, Miss Marple sat very still, her eyes upon the hymn book, her thoughts wandering to the quiet inevitability of human nature. When the day of the trial arrived, Chapelbourne felt both dread and excitement. A carriage carried Mrs. Arkwright away in the custody of constables, her face pale but defiant. A handful of villagers travelled by train to the county town, eager to be present at the proceedings, though most remained behind, content to await the news that would travel swiftly back. Miss Marple did not attend. She had no taste for public spectacles of misery. Instead, she sat by the vicarage fire, her knitting needles clicking softly, while Mrs. Pottle fretted beside her. "Do you think they will convict her, Jane?" she whispered. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "They must. The evidence is plain. But whether conviction brings peace, that, my dear, is another matter." Indeed, the trial proved as dramatic as the villagers had feared. Witnesses described the fête, the lemonade, the handkerchief with its embroidered initials. Dr. Leslie explained the presence of digitalis. Inspector Graves gave his testimony with pompous solemnity. And finally, Miss Marple herself was called, though she spoke briefly and without flourish, explaining simply what she had observed. The insistence with which Mrs. Arkwright arranged the glasses, the anxious eyes that betrayed her. Mrs. Arkwright protested fiercely from the dock, declaring she had acted only for Eleanor's sake, that she had sought to free her from a tyrant's grasp. But her words rang hollow, and when the jury filed back into the courtroom, their verdict was unanimous, guilty. That evening, as the news returned to Chapelbourne, the village reacted in a dozen different ways. Some gasped, some nodded knowingly, some muttered about justice served. A few shook their heads, unwilling to reconcile the bustling woman who had managed their fates with the poisoner condemned at the assizes. At the vicarage, Reverend and Mrs. Pottle sat by the fire, listening to Miss Marple's calm reflections. "It is finished now," Mrs. Pottle said softly. Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Not quite, my dear. For Chapelbourne will carry the shadow for years to come. Murder does not end with conviction. It leaves a scar, but scars, too, are part of life. The village will absorb it, just as it absorbs every quarrel, every sorrow. That is the way of small places." Reverend Pottle sighed heavily. "And what of Eleanor? Can she ever recover?" Miss Marple looked into the fire, her needles resting quietly in her lap. "She will, if she finds her own strength at last. Freed from both tyrant and friend, she may yet grow into herself. We must pray that she does." The fire crackled softly, the brook murmured beyond the window, and the chapel bell tolled the hour. Chapelbourne was quiet once more, but beneath its calm, the echoes of betrayal and revelation lingered still. And Miss Marple, serene as ever, knew that though the trial was over, the story of human nature was never finished. Chapter 11. Shadows lifted. The trial had passed, and with it the fever of speculation that had gripped Chapelbourne for so many weeks. The newspapers, always swift to move on, had departed in search of fresher scandals. The reporters hurried sketches of the Red Hart Inn and the chapel tower were already curling in wastebaskets elsewhere, replaced by new headlines. Yet in Chapelbourne itself, the air was still heavy with aftermath. The villagers carried themselves a little more stiffly, as though wary of one another's eyes. The revelation that Mrs. Arkwright, bustling, kindly, indispensable Mrs. Arkwright, had been the hand behind Sir Geoffrey's death remained a wound, raw and unhealed. And yet, life, as it always does, pressed forward. At the post office, Miss Finch sorted her letters with renewed vigour, whispering dramatically to every customer about the wickedness that can lurk even in our midst. Farmer Ludlow went about his work in the fields, muttering that it had been poison from the start, and that he had always said so. Mrs. Dacres, delighting in her role as survivor of a second attempt, received visitors in her parlour, and told the tale with such relish that one might almost think she had enjoyed her brush with danger. The Pottles moved with quieter dignity. Reverend Pottle's sermons touched now upon mercy and the hidden sins of pride. Though his voice often trembled, betraying how shaken he remained, Mrs. Pottle kept more closely to her embroidery, speaking less and watching the world with anxious eyes. And Miss Marple continued as ever, knitting in her chair, tending her roses, listening to the currents of human nature as they rippled and shifted around her. Lady Eleanor Carew was the one most altered by events. Freed from her husband's tyranny and from Mrs. Arkwright's suffocating guardianship, she seemed a woman emerging slowly from a long illness. Her movements were hesitant, her speech soft, but there was a spark in her eyes now that had not been seen in years. Miss Marple visited her often, not with questions, but with quiet companionship. They would sit together in the faded drawing-room of Chapelbourne Hall, the tarnished silver catching the afternoon light, while Miss Marple knitted and Lady Eleanor spoke hesitantly of the future. "I do not know if I can remain here," Eleanor admitted one day. "The hall is too full of shadows, Geoffrey's harshness, Alice's clinging presence. Every room feels haunted. You may find," Miss Marple said gently, "that shadows can be dispelled. A little care, a little light, and even the darkest corners are softened." Eleanor sighed. "And if I cannot bear it, what then?" "Then you will make a new life elsewhere," Miss Marple replied. "But remember, my dear, you need not decide at once. Healing is not done in haste." Eleanor reached out and clasped her hand. "You have been my truest friend, Jane. Without you, I think I should have broken entirely." Miss Marple smiled, her pale eyes kind. "You were stronger than you think, Eleanor. It was only that you were never permitted to see it." Inspector Graves, meanwhile, found himself in a curious position. Though the trial had ended in conviction, he was privately aware that his triumph had not been entirely his own. He encountered Miss Marple in the lane one morning, his moustache bristling more than usual, and raised his hat with awkward courtesy. "Good day, Miss Marple. I trust you are satisfied with the outcome." "I am satisfied that justice was done," Miss Marple said serenely. "Though it is a sad justice, for it costs a friend as well as a foe." The inspector cleared his throat. Yes, sad business. Still, can't have poisoners running loose. The law must be upheld." He hesitated, then added gruffly, "You saw what I did not. Must admit it, those little details, fussing with glasses, hovering at tables, I overlooked them." "You did not." Miss Marple's smile was gentle. "I have had much practice, Inspector. In villages, people reveal themselves most in what they do to be noticed least." He harumphed. "Well, I suppose there's sense in that. Still, I'd thank you to leave the next case to the police. Can't have every murder in England solved by knitting." "Of course not," Miss Marple replied mildly. "But human nature is stubborn, Inspector. In villages, people reveal themselves most in what they do to be noticed least." He harumphed. "Well, I suppose there's sense in that. Still, I'd thank you to leave the next case to the police. Can't have every murder in England solved by knitting." "Of course not," Miss Marple replied mildly. "But human nature is stubborn, Inspector. It will keep repeating itself, whether we attend or not." The inspector muttered something inaudible and strode away, though his expression bore the faintest trace of reluctant respect. The village fete committee, long dormant since that dreadful afternoon, attempted to reconvene. It was a pitiful gathering at first, held in Mrs. Ludlow's parlour, with only half the usual members in attendance. The absence of Mrs. Arkwright, once their tireless organizer, loomed heavily. "We shall never manage without her," Mrs. Ludlow declared, wringing her hands. No one else could keep the account straight, order the stalls, and arrange the bunting besides. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "I think you will manage very well indeed. When one person insists on doing everything, others forget what they can do themselves. But you will remember, and you will share the burden between you. That is often healthier." There was silence. Then Mrs. Ludlow said hesitantly, "Perhaps you are right, Miss Marple. Perhaps we relied too much on Alice." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It is the way of human nature, my dear. But strength grows when it is needed, and Chapelbourne will not be weaker for this loss." In the weeks that followed, the air of suspicion slowly ebbed. The children played once more in the lanes, without being called back hastily by anxious mothers. The brook, which had borne silent witness to so much, murmured again with its old serenity. Even the Red Harting returned to laughter and arguments about harvests rather than murder. And yet, for all this return to normality, Chapelbourne was altered. The villagers had looked into the mirror of their own lives and seen how malice and control could lurk behind familiar faces. They had whispered, judged, suspected one another, and they would not soon forget it. Miss Marple knew this. She sat one evening by the vicarage fire, her needles resting, her eyes thoughtful, as she reflected upon the matter. "It is not the poison alone that does harm," she murmured. "It is the mistrust it breeds, the fear it sows. Chapelbourne will recover, but it will remember, and perhaps that is no bad thing. A little humility, a little wariness, these may guard against pride." Mrs. Pottle, stirring the teapot, nodded solemnly. "I never thought Alice capable of it. She was always so kind to me." "Kindness," Miss Marple said softly, "may be genuine, or it may be only another form of control. That is what we must learn to discern." One evening, Lady Eleanor invited a small company to the hall, her first gathering since the trial. The rooms were still heavy with dust and faded splendor, but candles glowed, and flowers from the garden brightened the tables. Miss Marple attended, along with the Pottles, Dr. Leslie, and even Farmer Ludlow, though he grumbled at the idea. That night, back at the vicarage, Miss Marple sat once more by her window, gazing out at the chapel tower against the stars. The brook shimmered in the moonlight, silver and constant. Yes, she thought, Chapelbourne was healing. The shadows were lifting, though slowly. Human nature, she reflected, would always bring its share of darkness. But just as surely, light returned. She folded her knitting with care and whispered softly into the night. "The murderer is unmasked, but life goes on, and that, perhaps, is the greatest mystery of all." The owl hooted from the trees, the chapel bell tolled the hour, and Miss Marple, serene as ever, prepared for sleep, content that once again she had seen truth emerge from shadows. Chapter 12. The village restored. The summer light lingered long over Chapelbourne, as though reluctant to yield to dusk. The roses in the vicarage garden were in bloom again, their petals touched with soft colour, and the brook murmured on its timeless course. Outwardly, the village had resumed its rhythm. The shops opened as they always had, children darted along lanes, and the church bells summoned the faithful each Sunday. But beneath the surface, a subtle change had settled into the life of Chapelbourne. The easy trust that had once linked neighbour to neighbour had been shaken, and though daily habits returned, they did so with a new caution. Villagers measured their words more carefully, doors were locked earlier at night. Friendships, once untroubled, bore the marks of suspicion. And yet, there was also something else, a resolve, almost an unspoken agreement that life must be cherished more fiercely because of what had happened. It was Miss Marple who noticed this most clearly, for she had always believed that human nature, once tested, revealed both its worst and its best. The aftermath of Mrs. Arkwright's arrest continued to ripple. Some still struggled to believe it. At heart, She meant well, Mrs. Ludlow declared one morning, dusting flour from her apron as she spoke with Miss Finch. Why, she raised funds for the parish roof, organised the school pageant, and never forgot a birthday. Miss Finch sniffed, and poisoned the Colonel, let us not forget. I dare say she liked being in control of birthdays, too. That was Alice Arkwright all over. Everything done her way, or not at all. One evening, Lady Eleanor Carew came to the vicarage. She was still pale, her grief for her husband mingled with a strange, almost guilty relief. I find myself thinking, Miss Marple, she said quietly as they sat together, that I have been granted a kind of freedom. And yet, I do not know what to do with it. Geoffrey's hand ruled everything. Now that it is gone, I feel both lighter and lost. Miss Marple looked at her kindly over her knitting. It is natural to feel that way, my dear. A long shadow has lifted, but it leaves one blinking at the light. In time, you will learn where to walk without it. And Alice, Eleanor faltered, I thought her my truest friend. She claimed everything she did was for me. I never guessed it was also against me. That is the way with possessive natures, Miss Marple said softly. They cloak their hunger for control in the name of devotion. But true friendship does not bind, it frees. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, yet there was also a new strength in her voice as she said, Then I must learn to choose more carefully. To live by my own will, not by another's. Miss Marple reached out and patted her hand. Yes, my dear. That is precisely what you must do. At the Red Hart Inn, the gossip had finally begun to lose its edge. Henry Carroway, less bitter now that the weight of suspicion had lifted from his cousin, supped with his glass of ale and spoke of going to London once more, this time with prospects of honest work. I can't live off Eleanor's charity, he declared. Best I start afresh. Perhaps this whole business was the lesson I needed. Farmer Ludlow nodded. Best way forwards always with your own two hands. Trouble comes to those who lean too heavily on others. Miss Marple, who had joined them for a modest supper, said nothing, but her eyes twinkled. She had long known that tragedy could also be a turning point, pushing men and women into paths they might never have chosen otherwise. Inspector Graves, though vindicated by the arrest, still bore the marks of frustration. He visited the vicarage one afternoon, his boots clattering on the stone path, his notebook tucked under his arm. I won't deny it, Miss Marple, he said, clearing his throat. You've got the better of me this time. You saw what I overlooked, those little ways of hers, hovering, pouring, arranging. Never thought twice about them myself. Miss Marple smiled gently. It is often so, Inspector. We notice large things, shouts, quarrels, threats. But it is in the small things that people reveal themselves most truly. He grunted. Well, I'll not pretend I like being shown up by a lady with knitting needles. But I'll give you this, you were right. She inclined her head. It is not about being right, Inspector. It is only about understanding human nature. Once you understand why people do as they do, the how and when usually follow quite easily. The inspector tugged his moustache, half sheepish, half respectful. Human nature. I dare say I ought to take more notice of it. Though I'll never look at a jug of lemonade the same way again. The village fete committee met once more, this time in the Pottles' garden, with lemonade conspicuously absent. The women spoke hesitantly at first, uncertain without Mrs. Arkwright to guide, or command them, but soon. Voices grew steadier. Mrs. Ludlow offered to keep the accounts. Miss Finch volunteered for decorations. Even Mrs. Dacres, sharp-tongued as ever, agreed to supervise the raffle with her maid's assistance. Miss Marple, watching from her chair beneath the roses, observed how easily people adapted once freed from domination. Yes, she thought, the village is finding its balance again. One evening in late summer, the vicarage garden was filled with the sound of children laughing as they chased fireflies. Mrs. Pottle watched fondly, her hands busy with embroidery, while Reverend Pottle smoked his pipe in contentment. Miss Marple sat with them, her knitting folded aside, gazing at the glow of lanterns strung across the hedges. "It is good," Mrs. Pottle murmured, "to hear laughter again. For a while, I feared Chapelbourne had forgotten how. Laughter is like the brook," Miss Marple said softly. "It may be choked for a time, but it always finds its way back." The Reverend nodded gravely. "Still, the scars remain. We must preach not only forgiveness, but also caution. For evil, as you have often said, Jane, can hide in the most ordinary of hearts." Miss Marple's pale eyes twinkled. "Yes, Arthur, but so can goodness. And we must not let one blind us to the other." That night, when the garden had grown quiet and the lamps burned low, Miss Marple returned to her little room. She drew her shawl about her shoulders and sat by the window. The chapel tower rose black against the starry sky. The brook shimmered silver in the moonlight, and an owl called from the trees. She thought of the weeks gone by, of Sir Geoffrey's sudden fall, of gossip and suspicion, of poisoned lemonade and desperate protests. She thought of Mrs. Arkwright's trembling hands, her frantic eyes, her voice insisting that she only wished to help. "Human nature," Miss Marple murmured, "is much the same everywhere. Pride, jealousy, the need to rule, they bloom like foxgloves, fair to look at, but deadly when crushed. And yet, for every foxglove, there is a rose, for every shadow, a light." She folded her knitting neatly on the chair beside her, her expression serene. Tomorrow, the village would wake again. The shop bell would ring. The children would play. The brook would murmur on. Life, as it always did, would continue. And though Chapelbourne had been scarred, it would heal. For in the end, Miss Marple knew, truth always rose, slowly, quietly, but inexorably, like cream in a jug of milk. And with that thought, she let her eyes rest on the moonlit village below, a faint smile touching her lips. The mystery was ended, but life, with all its small secrets and larger truths, would never end. And that, she reflected, was the greatest mystery of all.
Thanks for watching.